She continued the legacy of Impressionism in Canada. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Jean Coulthard. Jean Coulthard was born in February 1908 in Vancouver, British Columbia. Her father was described as a pioneer doctor, and her mother was a music teacher. And it was through her mother that she came to know the first rudiments of music. It was through her mother that she came to know and adore the works of then-contemporary French composers. In the late 1920s, she got a scholarship to study at England's Royal College of Music, where she studied with Ralph vaughan Williams. She was unable to go through this course of study as fully and completely as she would have liked, but she did continue to study with various composers off and on during the Depression years. Off and on over the next couple of decades, she would meet such luminaries as Arnold Schoenberg, Bela Bartok, and Aaron Copland. She didn't study with these composers per se, but she wanted as many different opinions on her work as possible. In the early 1940s, she also studied with Australian-British composer Arthur Benjamin, who really pushed her to expand the scope and scale of her works. Her pieces up until that point had, generally speaking, been sort of small and vocal, but he wanted to see her write an orchestral piece. The pieces that she would come to write under his tutelage and guidance would come to solidify her place in the budding pantheon of Canadian composers. These are pieces that put her on the map. It helped that she was a very fast and prolific worker, with over 350 works completed during her career, and about half of these are vocal. After World War II, the Canadian arts scene blossomed into a period that she referred to as a springtime. She wanted to be as integral to this springtime as possible, and so she dedicated herself to not only promoting her works, but also the works of other Canadian composers. In 1947, she was hired by the University of British Columbia, which was just then trying to start a music department. Coulthard was one of the first faculty members hired, and she stayed with the program for 26 years, witnessing it go from a fledgling department of music all the way to being spun off into a full-fledged school of music. Her long tenure at the university meant that her students comprised a who's who list of Canadian composers, and a good number of these are still active today. For her, work at the university was a parallel career to her compositional activity. But Coulthard was also very concerned that her personal musical style was too conservative to stand its own against the rising tide of modernists who loved serialism and Webern and all sorts of mathematical complexity that her music just didn't exhibit. So she took a year off in the 1950s and used it to go over to France, where, among other things, she met the esteemed Mademoiselle Nadia Boulanger. She would never credit Boulanger with her renewed confidence in her own musical style, but when she came back to Canada, she was definitely rejuvenated. A year abroad helped her refocus what she was really after as a creative artist. She retired from the university in 1973, but this did not mean that she was retired from all of her musical activity in Western Canada. Far from it. She taught at and founded various festivals, and there's a good case to be made that she was actually more productive and prolific as a composer after her retirement. It was after her retirement, for instance, that she received a majority of the honors she would receive in her lifetime. While often less than forthcoming about her works and her musical processes, she did say that she basically split her works into two major categories. These categories can broadly be described as crowd pleasers and personal pieces. Make no mistake, pieces in both of these categories are of high quality. It's just how she envisioned who she was writing for. Pieces that she wrote on commission or pieces that she wrote for her friends would be included in the category of crowd pleasers. But in her personal pieces, she was not afraid of drawing upon various things that were considered more part of the musical avant-garde. She attempted to find ways to incorporate these into her own idiom, to some extent or another. She was the first composer of Canada's West Coast of any renown, and also one of the first female Canadian composers of any renown. Her music, as was briefly mentioned before, rejected the overarching trends of serialism that had gripped much of musical academia. She preferred instead to look back to her favorite French composers of her youth, the so-called Impressionists, and she wanted to capture something of their purity of emotion. What set her apart from many of her colleagues is that she was unafraid of writing music that actually appealed to wide audiences, even though, as mentioned, she was not afraid of incorporating incorporating various otherwise modernist techniques into her music, as experiments in seeing what she could assimilate. For her, music represented human values in an age of science, and that if music had any point in the furtherment of human welfare, it had to appeal to the heart and not the head. Her works are also often seen as expressing sentiments of Canadian nationalism. She pulled from the patriotic sentiments of the post-World War II years and set many great Canadian poets to music. She did not shy away in her vocal music of setting things that included bilingual puns. She also drew much inspiration from the natural beauty of her native province. She wasn't just a composer, she was a thoroughly Canadian composer, and she wanted that to show through as much as possible in her work. She passed away in March of 2000 at the age of 92, having, outside of some of her studies, lived in the Vancouver area pretty much all of her life. She was active until the very end and accepted commissions well into her 80s. And why wouldn't she? She was the first composer of Canada's West Coast to achieve not just a national, but an international reputation. Throughout her career, she was focused on an intensity of expression and a return to a neo-romantic artistic stance. This may have contrasted wildly with the establishment, but it was not simply pastiche on her part. As the former chair of the Canadian Council for the Arts put it, she retained an extraordinary sense of originality. Her efforts to bring a higher quality of musicality and musicianship to Canada's West Coast did not go unnoticed. Her quest to leave a legacy as the premier composer of that part of the world was eminently successful.